So I just spent some time looking at this Stripe login page and wanted to mention some brief things that I noticed for my future reference in terms of the design here. So there are five vertical lines. I don't know if you can see them, but there's one here. There's one at the edge of the um, left edge of this card. There's one in the center of the card. It's very faint. There's one on the right side of the card, and then there's one on the right over here. And what I notice is that the gap between each of these vertical lines is half of the width of this card. So this gap from this line to the edge of the card seems to be basically the same as one half of the width of this card. So it's one, two, three, four equally spaced vertical lines, and they're very faint, very faint. So they're so faint that I didn't even notice that they were there until I started looking at this page very carefully. Another thing is that there's two colors. There's the top part is different color from this bottom part. You can see very clearly here. Again, it's a very subtle thing where, you know, most people using this stuff, it doesn't draw attention to itself. Let me put it like that. It doesn't draw attention to itself. Um, and Another thing I noticed is that this this horizontal line, it might just be a coincidence, but what I noticed was that it passes directly, pretty much, yeah, this is the good way to see it, where this vertical line passes through this card is roughly halfway between where the inputs are and where the continue button is. So I would kind of consider it to be like the kind of the center of gravity of this page. Like your eyes are going to be centered around this point here as you're going to, typing this stuff in, and then you hit the continue button. So I think that's how they maybe chose where that diagonal line would pass through. Um, was there anything else? I mean, obviously these colors, the purple colors are similar to the purple color on the button, but they're actually not the same. They're not, they're subtly, slightly different. Um, and so I guess the general point I would make is that it seems like, and I noticed this when I was working on my own website, um, or let me go to it, is that basically you want ornamentation that doesn't draw attention to itself. And it's kind of like when people prefer music that has some grain to it, some imperfections that is additional detail, and it's more interesting. It makes the music more interesting to listen to. That's why I like listening to Justice, the Cross album. It has that, there's a lot of detail in the sound that's interesting to listen to more than just a pure sound. And so on my site, I added this very subtle or very slight gray, I don't know what's called, a drop shadow. I don't know, or background. Um, and you don't want it to draw attention to itself. You want it to be just at under the point where people notice it, because it adds that little bit of extra detail that makes it more interesting to look at, as opposed to, for example, I was trying to copy the design for my own website, and it just looks more plain. It's not as interesting to look at. And so I was thinking, okay, so if you wanted to follow this way of doing things, what are some other things you could do? Well, okay, you could have like, horizontal lines, or you could have like diagonal lines, just like stuff that's like subtly interacting with the card itself, because that's what makes it make sense. Because I was thinking like, you can have just like a background image for your, on your website, and I've done that on another site, but it doesn't it doesn't show good design. Like it's kind of like arbitrary, right? It doesn't show care, because there's no, it could be anything. It looks, I don't know how to put it. Like it doesn't show that there was care put into it if it's just a background image that has no interaction with what your stuff is on the site. So, I mean, like another thing you could do is maybe have like, I don't know, ornamentation around the edge of the card. I don't know, but it was just something that I thought was interesting. I'm not sure how they chose the height these um, of these what do they call these stripes? Oh, they're literally stripes. Um, they look like they are similar in height to these input boxes, but they don't look like they're maybe exactly the same. They look like maybe a little bit less tall. Um, so anyway, I just thought that was interesting to think about how this is made to look nice. Yeah. Oh, and also I realized that I had made some changes, and so I just refreshed it. And I wanted to also point out that this stripe extends to seemingly halfway the distance between this vertical line and the edge of the card. And then on the other side, the vertical line isn't quite in the middle, so it's a little bit off to the right. And so again, it's like slight imperfections that I think add some grit, or I don't know what you would call that, color, or um, yeah, these. At least that's how I perceive it, because otherwise, why would this one be so perfect, but that one's not perfectly in the middle? That's my best explanation, is that the slight imperfections make it a little bit more interesting, but they're like slight imperfections that deviate around an aesthetically appealing um, value. So like this is clearly hinting at being in the middle, right? It's clearly hinting at being in the middle the way this one is. So it's kind of like when you're listening to a person sing and maybe their voice is just a little bit out of tune at times, but it's varying around an aesthetically appealing sound. And so that's my best explanation for what is going on with these. Um, yeah, and you could see how like this purple line is across the top of this line, this purple line is across the bottom of that line. So you could, it's again, that idea of like kind of dancing around a single value, dancing variation that varies around a single idea. So the single idea here is this line going through the middle of this card, and then you have this variation around that idea. As for this one, this box, I think again, it's another example of just adding some variation around that idea. So the line, so it's overlapping at that line. But what is how do they determine the width of this, for example? Does it change? No. Yeah, it doesn't change. So the width of this seems like it's a variation, it's hinting at this same width here. So it's not exactly the same width. It's just a little bit larger. And in fact, I wonder if the difference, because this is a little bit larger than this width, this one's a little bit smaller than this width. So I wonder even if this, the extra distance in this one would be enough to make up. I'm not sure. I think it's maybe too much. But it's interesting, right? Like this one, this light blue one is a little bit wider than this distance here, this half gap. This one is a little bit narrower than this half gap. So it's like variation around that idea, but there's thought put into it, or it's trying to it's like creating patterns that you can pick up on. I don't know. That's my best guess. Uh, and so that's my goal here is just to try to understand when I make my own website, how do I make it look nicer? Um, and so looking at something like this is a way to get some ideas of what they're doing. And I guess, yeah, so what I would say is that if I was to summarize the design principle here, it's that you have a single idea. I think the single idea here is that you have this line through the center of the page, and then around that idea, you build um, variation. So, above this line, it's lighter gray. Below the line, it's white. You have this line, below it, this one above it. So it's all this variation. And then the other idea I would say in this page, on design idea, is that you have these vertical lines. You're paying attention to the distance of this card, the width of this card. These vertical lines are all about the width of this card, and so half the width of the card, and then this one's half of that. So those I would say are the two ideas here. You have these vertical lines that are alluding to the width of the card, and then you have this um, diagonal line that's alluding to this center of gravity here, halfway between the inputs and the button. And then it's just like variations built around those two ideas, little subtle things built around those two ideas.